Good evening. Welcome to the Hooked on History series, sponsored by the First Bank of Alabama. This series is for your enjoyment, and we certainly want the people at the bank to know that we appreciate their participation. Chris, would you see that that's taken care of? We're really in for a treat. I know that I talked to Dr. Hansen. He thinks this is, over the years, he's been here 4 or 5 times. We're not sure, well, which. But I promise you that this is going to be one of the most exciting ones we've had. Let me just remind you that Dr. Hansen holds a PhD from Ohio State University. They're known for something other than football, and that's famous people, and he's one of them. He's a former historian for the Space Center. He taught at Auburn University, served as his department chair, director of the Honors College. His book, The First Man, I started to say his first book, but he has more books than you can, a show dog can jump over, I promise you. The First Man, The Life of Neil Armstrong, is the first and only authorized biography of Neil, so our speaker has been to the moon and back, so he's here today. As figure of speech, he really didn't go, so don't be telling me that. But he's been here before. Robert Trent Jones, I think, was the most exciting one, because I told Sarah just a while ago that one of the famous things, he's an avid golfer, but he had the opportunity to play with Clint Eastwood. And so, Jim, you can go ahead and make our day when you get ready. But the First Man film became very famous. Universal Studios, it was nominated for several awards, and they did win an Academy Award. As I said, he is an avid golfer. He did that book, the program on the Robert Trent Jones Golf Course Trail in Alabama, and we're so delighted to have him, and he has his wife with him. Because of the situation, he will have some other things he's going to do at the end of the program. You will not get to talk to him because he's got to stay clean and clear so that he can go to the hospital for his operation. So if y'all will cooperate with us, when he gives a question and answer time, we will not continue that. We will just usher them out, and so that'll be the reason. It's not because just because he talked to Clint Eastwood, he doesn't want to talk to you. But Jim, it's a real pleasure to have you, and so we turn the program over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I'm mic'd up already. All right, thanks. Well, thank you so much for being here. It is, I think, maybe my 5th time here, and this is just such an amazing library. Every time I come, I ask about the projects they're involved with, and they're cutting edge. I mean, they're not going on like this anywhere else, certainly in the state. So here's the story. Or maybe I should say it's really the backstory, because I want to take a few minutes to start to sort of explain how I'm even doing a book about the Lindberghs. And so it requires a little autobiography on my part. I did retire from Auburn in 2017, and like a lot of retired people, the plan you have for retirement doesn't really pan out exactly the way that you wanted it to. I planned on playing a lot of golf, traveling the world. I think I'm in Denmark on the right side, and I'm in Scotland on the left side, and I plan to do a lot more of that. Also in retirement, I was going to spend a lot of time with my grandkids. I've got 4 grandchildren, and they all live in the Birmingham area, so we actually moved after retirement, built a little home in Hoover so we could be close to the grandkids. So I wanted to have a lot of nonsensical time with the grandkids. And I wanted to travel more. Peggy and I, we love to travel together. We've been to Switzerland a number of times. I think both of these are actually in Switzerland. And so we were hoping for that to happen after retirement. But then along came COVID. And that changed everybody's life, as you well know, for a period of time. Peggy's mother, Marilyn Miller, who actually came to one of my talks here in Silicaga when she was visiting from Indiana, she had gotten quite ill in her, I think she was 93 when she passed, but she came, we had her living with us in Hoover for a while. And so COVID sort of changed the plan for what retirement would be at the time. I had planned, I didn't have an office in this new home. So if I did any writing, it was going to be, you can see my look of kind of like, what am I supposed to do here? I ended up writing on the island in the kitchen. So any writing I was going to do was going to have to wait till, they went home for the day for me to get any writing done. And I actually decided in the midst of all and it's hard to say the COVID period was a chaotic period, but a distressing period, I got this idea of, well, maybe I could find some calm in some sort of a writing project. So I actually recalled, and there was something I found in the Neil Armstrong papers. There was a telegram from 1969 that was written from the quarantine facility after they came back from the moon. And it was a copy of a telegram to a man named John Fairfax, and there was congratulations for him being the first person ever to row a boat by himself, all alone, across the Atlantic Ocean. And the Apollo 11 astronauts thought, that's really something compared to going to the moon seems like a breeze compared to rowing a boat by yourself across the Atlantic Ocean. So I started thinking, well, that'd be a cool book, especially when I found out there was another guy who was trying to beat him across. One guy was Fairfax went from coast of Africa to Florida, and the other one left from Newfoundland and went to Ireland. And so I thought, well, maybe I could write a book and I could be on that island. I could put on my earbuds, which I did, and I could play ocean music, the sound of roaring oceans, which would block out whatever my wife and her mom was watching on television, probably some game show, and I could maybe, do this. I ended up writing a book called Completely Mad, Tom McLean, John Fairfax, and the Epic Row Solo Across the Atlantic. And it's going to be published in the spring. I call it Completely Mad because that's what they were. They both admit it. McLean is still living. Fairfax actually died a few years back. So I wrote this book. I wrote it very quickly during COVID. I did Skype interviews with McLean, who's still alive, and he lives in Scotland. And so that was how I kind of kept my sanity through the COVID period. And I thought, well, maybe that's going to be my last book. I've done enough books, and I didn't even plan to do this one, but it got me through COVID with a little more sanity. But then I got this phone call out of the blue, literally out of the blue, from Eric Lindbergh, who is Charles and Anne were his aunt and uncle. He is the son of John Lindbergh, the second child of Charles and Anne, the first child after the kidnapping and murder of Charlie Jr., who had been killed and died in 32, and John was born, I think, in 33 or 34. And so I got this call from Eric Lindbergh about the Lindbergh Foundation, which I knew existed. It was an organization that was established in 1974 in honor of Charles Lindbergh originally, and then when Anne died in 2001, her name was added to the foundation. And they are in the midst of preparing for the 100th anniversary. In the year 2027, it will be the 100th anniversary of Lindbergh's transatlantic solo flight from New York to Paris. And so they're looking ahead, and they wanted to know if I would be interested in writing a book that they could use as kind of a centerpiece for the 100th anniversary of the flight. Well, yeah, you're not going to not talk to the Lindbergh Foundation. And Reeve Lindbergh, who's the youngest child of Anne and Charles, she was born in 1945 and is still living, and she's kind of the honorary president of the Lindbergh Foundation. So I eventually ended up talking with her, and I Skyped with the foundation board, I don't know, 2, 3, or 4 times to talk over what it was they had in mind. Well, what they had in mind, and this is their mission statement that is current. The intent was to honor the Lindbergh's pioneering contributions in aviation, exploration, conservation, sciences, and humanities. Knowing the Lindbergh's vision of a balance between the technological advancements they helped pioneer and the preservation of the human and natural environments they cherished, it was decided that this balanced vision would become the cornerstone of the Foundation's programs. And so they help support all kinds of different efforts to find a way of balancing technology and environment, which, very worthwhile cause. And they were, as I learned through my conversations with them, what they were really interested in was a book that would focus on the Foundation, which would be from '74 to the present and everything that they've done. They recently made the news because they announced a new challenge for the aviation industry to find a way to accelerate decarbonization of the world's airliners, to help the environment by getting rid of the carbon emissions. And so I wasn't not interested in maybe doing that sort of book, but it wasn't exactly my cup of tea. It wasn't exactly anything I wanted to. I hadn't planned on writing another book, period. But I started thinking, well, they sent me some materials to look at, which I did. And then I started thinking, well, I want to go a little bit deeper into who Charles and Ann were. Not that I hadn't. I taught the history of flight for my entire career. I thought, virtually all the important stuff to read about Lindbergh. But there was a lot that I hadn't touched base with, so I thought again, it's COVID, and I'm home all the time, and I've got time to do some things. This is a stack of my books relative to Lindbergh, and I started looking through them. There's a big literature, obviously, and so one thought I had was, well, the Foundation hasn't had a history written, so that would be original. But gosh, there's been so much written about Charles and Ann Morrow Lindbergh. Is there anything new that one can say? And so I thought I'd better get immersed back into this literature to know exactly what it amounts to. And in fact, this book in 1998 was published by A. Scott Berg, which won the Pulitzer Prize. It is considered still the definitive biography of Charles Lindbergh. And of course, you can't write a biography of Charles without talking about his wife and his marriage. And so this is a big book and a well-received book, a prize-winning book. So I thought, well, you don't really want to do that over again. And then there's this. As I knew all of this, but I've come to learn it a lot greater. So there's one concern about writing a book about the Lindberghs is, well, there's already been so much written. And the second thing to be concerned about is, boy, there's a lot of controversy in this history. To say that writing a book about Lindbergh is highly challenging is a gross understatement. No American of the 20th century provoked more controversy during his lifetime than Lindbergh, and the controversies embroiling his life and legacy have only grown more intense, publicly widespread, vociferous, and nasty over the 48 years since his death in 1974. So what I thought I'd do very briefly, and I'm going to talk about 5 major controversies, but I'm going to only be able to briefly summarize them because each one of them would take me more than an hour to really talk about. They're all very hefty subject matter. The first controversy involves the kidnapping and death of their firstborn child, Charles, or Charlie Jr. This happened in 1932. The baby was not quite 2 years old. And the controversies that still remain are, they're all over the place. A man by the name of Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German immigrant to the United States, was eventually caught and tried and found guilty and executed by the New Jersey State Penitentiary. And there are still to this day people who believe, and I'll show you some books here in a second, who believe that he did not act alone, that there had to be at least one accomplice with him. And there have been, I think that the trial, which was considered the trial of the century, it was like the O.J. trial of the 1930s, if not bigger than the O.J. trial. Everybody was following it on the newsreels and in the newspapers, on the radio broadcasts. And some law schools even used the Lindbergh trial as a case study for the law students to study. But there's controversies over whether Hauptmann actually really did it, whether or not he had accomplices. In the investigation itself has been questioned. The FBI was involved. The New Jersey State troopers were involved. There's concerns that Lindbergh himself, who actually had almost like he took over the investigation. Here he is, the father of the kidnapped child, and he seems to a lot of people like he had too much control over what the police were doing. And there's actually, here are some of the books, just some of the books that one can find dealing with the kidnapping and Hauptmann trial. The book up on the left, Suspect Number 1, is probably the most kind of off-the-shelf kind of interpretation. Who is suspect number 1? This is a book written by a woman who is a former federal court judge out in California. To her, suspect number 1 is Lindbergh himself. There is a belief out there that Lindbergh was involved in the kidnapping of his own child for reasons that had to do with, I'll mention something in just a second, and that one version of the theory is that he was involved. He wasn't intending on having the boy killed. The boy was killed in an accident, perhaps dropped from the ladder that was up on took the baby out of the second floor window. The baby was dropped. Lindbergh didn't plan that, but he did plan to have the baby institutionalized. I'm going to tell you why why some people think he might want to have done that. But this is just full of, it's just crazy controversy. It really is. It's crazy controversy. And it's not going to go away. It's been here since 1932 and will remain. There are all kinds of novels that have been written about the Lindbergh, based on the Lindberghs. They're novels, so they're fictional, but they take the basis of the history, of the biography, and they turn it into something that's just embellished and I said fictional. So these are just 4 of the ones that I know about. The second controversy, and all these controversies are going to relate to one another. They all sort of blend into one major integrated controversy. This is a controversy involving Charles's interest in eugenics. Eugenics was, I think the translation from the Greek is that good genes. It's the idea that the human population can be improved, it can be progressed by a more rational system of who's marrying who's having children, who shouldn't be having children. Eugenics was a very, very almost mainstream kind of idea from the late 19th century. It kind of comes out of Darwinism in a way, from the late 19th, survival of the fittest, from the late 19th into the 20th century. And there was a eugenics society in Great Britain and in other countries. There was lots of people that were eugenics, mainstream sorts of people. And Lindbergh got very interested in eugenics, particularly if you see the pictures to the right. He becomes involved in the early 1930s. And of course, his flight, remember, is 1927. So he's become this great celebrated hero by the time this happens. But he gets involved with a man named Dr. Alexis Carrel, who was a Frenchman who came to work in New York at the Rockefeller laboratories on Manhattan. He was a Nobel Prize winner, and he was a eugenist of a sort, and very interested in trying to find ways of having human beings live longer, and trying to do surgeries that had been considered too risky. And Lindbergh gets very interested and Carrel becomes he becomes a mentor to Charles. Charles's relationship with Carrel is going to become very, very strong through the 30s. And Charles and him will write a few books together. I think my next slide maybe shows that. Well, yeah, The Culture of Organs they do together. I think it's published in 36 or 37. Carrel is a really important person to study in his own right. And then this is a book called The Immortalists. They're essentially looking for ways that the human body can be sustained through organ transplantation and different kinds of methodologies to extend lifespan. But also, not everybody needs to have this done. That's what eugenics, why it engenders so much controversy, that there's the idea that some people just shouldn't be having children because they're defective in some way. And the people, connecting the first controversy with the second one, there is this idea coming from the eugenics interest that Lindbergh had, that his first child, Charlie Jr., was defective in some way. Charles thought he was, that he was kind of hydrocephalic, he had an oversized head, so they thought. I have a grandson that grew up little with a very big head, but we didn't ever think anything wrong with him. And that he also Charlie Jr. had a mild case of rickets. And so this medical evidence for the conspiracy theorists suggests, well, this is a motive for Charles having his child kidnapped and institutionalized him, because he felt he was a defective of some sort. So he was trying to just, he didn't want to claim him as his own or whatever, and he was going to have him institutionalized, but accidentally he was killed. So the eugenics controversy and the eugenics element of Lindbergh and the kidnapping, they get grouped together, as will the next controversies. In the mid-30s, Charles and Anne, they've actually moved to Europe. They first moved to England, and then they moved to France because they're trying, after the kidnapping and death of Charlie, they have another son, John, and they just can't protect. They don't feel like they can protect him from all of the intrusions of the press and gangsterism, possibly, who might have been involved in the original kidnapping of Charlie. So they're in Europe, and Charles actually, and I'm going to maybe read you an excerpt, but just to give you a little bit of he's there not just as a tourist. When he's living in Europe, the military air attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin, this Hitler's come to power, the German military is, growing in power, and the air attaché in Berlin, the American air attaché, contacts Charles and says, we can't find out as much stuff about what's happening with the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, as we need to know. We want to know what they're doing. And we can't get access to the airfields and to the generals and all this stuff. We think maybe you can. So would you consider coming to Berlin kind of as a secret agent to figure out what the Germans are doing and to write reports for us? So he goes to Germany not because he's interested in Hitler or the Nazis. He's interested because of what they seemingly are doing with their military. And so he goes and he's at the embassy, and he's treated just like the embassy wants him to be treated. He's being taken out. General Goering, who's the head of the Luftwaffe, is making sure that Lindbergh gets to go to different airfields and different aircraft factories. And Charles sees and writes reports for the American War Department. So he's in Germany. But the fact that he is in Germany, and if you can see the very top middle, I must say something about this, I think, if I have time. He gets a medal. There's a dinner at the U.S. Embassy in 1936 where it's a dinner of all men. There's German officers there, but there's also ambassadors from Belgium and Italy, but it's at the American Embassy. And the American ambassador has asked Charles, make sure you come to this dinner, because we're going to be important Germans here, and we want a better relationship between the U.S. Embassy and the German government, because the war's still down the road a little bit. And so, but while he's there, unannounced, no one knew this was going to happen, Goering pulls out this medal to give to Lindbergh. Well, and you have a picture that then makes into the newspapers, that Lindbergh accepts this Nazi medal from Hermann Goering. Doesn't look very good. And there are some other statements that Charles makes while he's there. Of course, he's not trying to offend the German host, because he's kind of on a spy mission. He's trying to get inside and find out as much stuff as he can. But this all leads to, and then when Lindbergh comes back to the United States, in 1939, he's against American involvement in the Second World War. The war starts in 1939. The British and the French obviously are in it. But the United States don't get in it until after Pearl Harbor in 1941. And Lindbergh becomes part of the America First movement, which is to keep America out of the war. It becomes very controversial. He becomes a very controversial figure. And his connections back to Nazi Germany are, somewhat misconstrued as to why he was there. I mean, it wasn't public knowledge that he was there working on behalf of the Army Air Corps. So you have all these concerns about him being a Nazi, him being a fascist. And that's any book that deals with Lindbergh is going to have to face that topic, that controversy head on. And here are some of the books that come out about, that are out there, that have already been written, where Lindbergh plays a prominent role. Oh, I have to be aware. Anybody who's going to take on a topic has to be aware of that. And in fact, some of you may know, if you watch HBO, there's a series called The Plot Against America, based on a book by Philip Roth, which was a bestseller. And this is an alternative history, meaning what the storyline for The Plot Against America is that Lindbergh in 1940, that the right wing basically puts him up as the candidate for the American presidency, and he defeats Franklin Roosevelt because he pushes his fascism, he pushes anti-Semitism, and he's elected in 1940. And so this is what would happen in America if Charles Lindbergh, fascist/anti-Semite, pro-Hitler, becomes president in 1940. It's purely fanciful stuff. It flies in the face of true history and biography in enormous ways, but that's out there now, and some people maybe even think that he ran for president in 1940. He had absolutely no political interests whatsoever. And another thing that makes it controversy today, and I just put this melange of things up there, I don't read too much into them, but you might know if you're reading the papers that because of the political polarization we have in our country today, Lindbergh is brought up a lot now in newspaper articles and on TV because the America First movement of the World War II era, America First is kind of resonating again in some quarters. And so Lindbergh has become more and more controversial because of our controversy of today, our polarization of today, our politicization of everything today. So anything about Lindbergh that's written is going to have to sort of meet up and somehow find a way to deal with what the popular mentality and the media mentality is about Lindbergh. Controversy number 4, I've already mentioned. There's a strong suggestion that he was anti-Semitic. He made a speech in Des Moines, Iowa, for the First America Committee in, I think it's in September of 1941, so a few months before Pearl Harbor, where he names Jewish people, Jews, as one of 3 major agitators leading America to war: the Roosevelt administration, British propaganda, and Jewish interest in pushing America into war. He mentions them. It's the first time, and really the only time, publicly, that he mentions Jews by name. In his private writings, you find more references to them. But the issue of him, and what kind of anti-Semite was he? What kind of qualifications do you want to make about that, if any? Was he really anti-Semitic? He never believed he was. Anne didn't think he was either. Anne defended him, but she also thought he was really mistaken to use the word Jews, to talk about Jews by name. And she had tried to talk him out of doing it, but it didn't work. But that was the only time in Des Moines. And his speech after that was in Fort Wayne, Indiana, which happened to be Peggy in my hometown. And this was in October 41. And he stayed away from, he didn't talk about the Des Moines speech. He didn't talk about Jews at all. But it's there. I mean, now in the public mind, Charles was probably a fascist, and he was anti-Semitic. Controversy number 5, this one maybe you've not heard of. In the mid to late 1950s, Charles, he is traveling to Europe a lot. He's a consultant for Pan American Airlines, and he's helping to do various things for Pan Am. He's away from home a lot. Well, one thing that the family in America did not know until after Anne died, actually they had to wait till the 21st century. Charles had affairs with 3 women in Europe, resulting in 7 children. Anne knew nothing about it. I've talked to Reeve, the youngest child, the daughter who's still living. Reeve and I have become, she's my main person for oral history from the family. And Reeve tells me that she believes her mother suspected that something was going on, but she didn't really even want to know what it was, and didn't know what it was. It's been, when Anne died, Brigitte Hesheimer, her children, the 3, Derek, Astrid, and David, they came out publicly for the very first time after Brigitte had kept this a secret from her own children until they were adults, that they were the offspring of Charles Lindbergh and her. And there was a big news conference in Munich, I think it was, and it's led to subsequent DNA testing. And this has all been confirmed now. The Lindbergh family in America accepts this as all as being true. And we don't know the names of the two sons from Valeska. Valeska was actually Charles's kind of his secretary or his assistant whenever he made European trips. Brigitta and Marietta, interestingly enough, were sisters. And the fact that, relationship, there's been a book written about this. Let me push back to it. I got to go backwards. No, I'm not going backwards. No. Yeah. The book on the left, Das Doppelleben des Charles A. Lindbergh, The Double Life of Charles A. Lindbergh. In German, never been translated into English. Fortunately, I studied German in college, so I've read the book carefully. And it's her family that first made this public. These are pictures from Brigitta, from the book, showing Brigitta, showing Charles without his shirt on, with Brigitta. So he would go over, she lived in the Munich area. The other sister lived in Switzerland. And the third woman lived over by Lake Constance, so they were somewhat separated geographically. Anyway, I could go on and on about this. I'm hoping to interview as much of this European family as I can. These are letters. This is also from the book in German. These are letters that Brigitta had from Charles and pictures of the children as they were growing up. Charles would go there and maybe stay 3-4 weeks. And then he would go back to America, or he would go he'd maybe go from Munich down to Switzerland, to visit the other family. He had these 3 hidden families. It's like, what? So that's a controversy as well. And here you see the 3 children from Brigitta. There you see Reeve. Reeve has actually gone to Germany and met with this family. I don't think she's met with the others. And there she is with her brother Land. Reeve has handled when they found out about this, the American family, Reeve, it was hard to believe it and accept it, but she, of all the family members, has done the best with that. The brothers haven't done quite as well, and they haven't interacted with the European children at all. And this I just put in there because these are his American children. He, besides Charlie was first, then John was born, then Land was born, then Anne, they called her Ansley, was born, and then Scott was born, and then Reeve was born. And then she had a miscarriage in the late 40s, or would that have been another child. So those are the American Lindbergh children. There's Reeve, and Reeve has been such an important person for me. And so what am I doing? So I have to backtrack just a bit. So we have just a lot of books about Lindbergh, and we have these controversies. And I'm being asked by the Lindbergh Foundation to consider writing a book about the foundation. And what I've done actually is try to think about what can I do that's original? Let me go back to this. What can I do that's original? And I would just want to read you a paragraph from the proposal that I ended up writing. I ended up proposing a book very different from what the foundation wanted because it was just not something I was terribly interested in. The literature on Charles Lindbergh is vast, but it is not definitive. No author has ever focused on a book on what might be called the marital biography of Charles and Anne. Even members of today's Lindbergh family acknowledge the need for this approach if history is ever to arrive at a truly authentic understanding of who Charles and Anne were, not just as a couple, but as individuals. And I quote from a book that Reeve has written. Reeve's written some nice books that are memoirs of her parents. And she wrote in one of these books, "Those who research and write about my parents almost always choose to focus on either Charles or Anne, to separate their stories and examine each one individually. It is so easy in a century that places such value upon individual achievement to underestimate the power of a partnership, especially in a marriage. But the story of Reeve's famous parents is the marriage." Reeve wrote, "Despite their equally independent characters and their lifelong separate affinities for solitude, my parents' time together marked the most productive period of their lives. After my father's 1927 solo flight brought them together in the first place, all of their most successful ventures were collaborative. The early survey flights, the 6 children, the many books they wrote, not in collaboration, but in mutual awareness and with mutual support. Each of my parents, I believe, was the single most important factor in the other's writing career. And so I took that statement and started thinking more about it and thought, well, what kind of picture can you get of them as individuals? If you don't study them as individuals per se, but everything is, you try to look through the lens of the marriage. You're looking at them solo, because you need to do that, but you're also looking at them together. What does that lens tell you? And so I thought more and more about that, and what really converted me to doing the book that I'm doing is looking at Anne's diaries and letters, which are mostly all published. There are some that didn't make it into the published books that are in archives, most of them at Yale or at Smith College where she went to school. So I want to understand her better, but I want to understand her in her relationship with Charles to have me understand her better and to understand Charles. Because here's the thing, even in terms of the question of Charles's affairs, Anne apparently had hers too. Earlier than Charles, in the early 50s, her physician, Dr. Dana Ashley, I've talked at length with Reeve about this, and I've looked at the letters, and it's absolutely clear that she did have an affair with Dana that lasted quite a while, and that Charles probably learned about it, and there's one possible theory that Charles was actually acting out and hadn't had affairs until he found out that Anne had one. So there's that to throw into the mix as well. I mean, these are complicated people, and you have to treat complicated people with nuance and thoughtfulness. But here I am with these 5 controversies, and if anybody's going to do any kind of book about them, you've got to somehow deal with them. And I'm doing my best, and this is a work in progress. I'm about halfway through at this point. And again, you've got a problem. You've got a major book on Lindbergh, Charles, a major book on Anne that was published, both of them back in the 90s, though. Both of these books were published before anything was known about the families, the children in Europe. And a lot of other things have been discovered as well. So these books, as definitive as they seem to be, and still are in many respects, now are getting a little dated. This is my proposal, front page, solo and together. St. Martin's Press has decided to publish it. But here's what really moved me to doing the kind of book I did. These are the covers of Anne's diaries and letters books, starting with a book that she kept her these diaries are amazing. I mean, they're worth reading for anybody interested in Anne Morrow or women's history or the Lindberghs. And these diaries are incredible. And the insights into her relationships with everyone, including her mother and her father and her brother and 2 sisters. And of course, her feelings about Charles. I mean, it's almost a day-to-day kind of thing. And so when I read these diaries, and Peggy can tell you, that's what really convinced me that I think if you focus on the marriage and you try to look at these 2 life stories, solo and together, that you maybe can come up with some new insights into who they were. And I think I'm finding that to be true. So these are just images suggesting the marital biography as I see it. I mean, I'm looking at them over the years and trying to, you can't connect absolutely everything to the marriage, but you can do a better job of that than what anybody's done before by looking at it as a marital biography. I want to see them as individuals. I want to understand Lindbergh better. I want to understand Anne better through my book. But I want to understand them better by looking at them as a married couple and the marriage. Now, I'm going to end by reading you one excerpt from my book, and I'm going to change which one I'm going to do. There was a couple that I was thinking about doing, but I'm going to do this one. This is an excerpt that comes from a chapter that deals with the kidnapping and murder of their first child. This is, the baby was kidnapped, and it took took a little bit of time, a matter of weeks before the body was found. The body was actually found, like the headline said, 5 miles from home. It was, they were looking everywhere for this child. They were hoped against hope that the baby was still living, but he died really probably a few hours after he had been kidnapped. So the baby's been discovered. The baby's body's been discovered. Charles is actually on a boat out off the coast of New Jersey, where someone has suggested that there was somebody that wanted to meet with them and to negotiate a deal for the baby's return. So he was actually, he tracked all those things down as best as he could. Anne was at home with her mother in New Jersey. So this is just an excerpt. 2 or 3 things came up in their conversation that were not exactly consoling, but kept them from absolute remorse. This is Charles's return now, and he's with her. One was that the medical examiner, Charles Mitchell, was quite sure that the baby was killed the very first night, with the police detectives offering the theory that the kidnappers may have murdered the child in such a way as to hide the evidence. If so, nothing she and Charles did or didn't do could have made any difference. Not, quote, is the quote, not if we had tried to keep it a secret, we couldn't have anyway. Not if we could have kept the publicity down, not if the ransom bill list had not leaked out. From the apparent blow in the head, the baby must have been killed immediately. Charles soothed Anne by saying, I don't think he knew anything about it, a sentiment that helped her greatly in the coming days and weeks. She could feel at least a little less horror knowing that the kidnappers, men of the lowest brutality, did not have the baby for long. I know this is not real comfort. Nothing is, she wrote to Charles's mother, but it is something definite for one's mind to settle on. It was a relief to know definitely that he did not live beyond that night. As for Charles's mood, he did not lie down the entire night, but rather kept working over all the evidentiary information given to him by the detectives. Anne tried to get him at least to sleep a bit, but he told her that was impossible. He promised he would try to sleep the next night. Anne told his mother that it was not just herself that was not able to yet express clearly what she was feeling. Charles, too, was inarticulate. Anne had not seen that in him ever before, and attributed it to his being so worn down and weary. Charles's austerity that long sleepless night was even harder for Anne to fathom than it regularly was. In her diary, where she was always more honest about her feelings than she was in her letters, especially about Charles, when writing to his mother, her tone grew up quite a bit darker when thinking about how Charles was handling the murder of their son. Charles sat beside her every hour, producing an atmosphere of quiet calm for husband and wife, but for Anne it came off quite strange. I could see it all as if from a great distance, his terrible patience and silence, terrifying. She could only imagine what he was thinking, what he was visualizing. But for Anne, as dawn broke, everything flooded back over me, a personal physical loss, my little boy, no control over tears, no control over the 100 little incidents I had jammed out of sight when I was bargaining for my control. It became impossible for Anne to talk without crying. She lamented a few hours later in her diary, immortality perhaps for the spark of life, but not for what made up my little boy. Some tough decisions had to be made that day. Were they going to the morgue in Trenton to see their son? Did Anne want to go? Could she bear it? Should Charles go alone? What did they want done with the body? Should it be placed in a coffin and buried? Would it be better to cremate it? Either way, did they want any sort of ceremony or religious service? There is no record of any conversations leading to their answering any of these questions, but we know the outcomes. In the mid-afternoon, Charles drove to Trenton by himself. The boy's body was to be cremated, and there would be no service of any kind. Perhaps Anne wanted to see the remains of the child. Perhaps she concluded she could not suffer it. Or perhaps Charles insisted that it was better for her not to go. Whatever the discussion, it does not seem from anything that Anne ever wrote that she was opposed to any of the decisions. Rather, she entered in her diary, in her diary, she always referred to Charles as just C, capital C, period. See to Trenton, the cremation, the blanket. See going through that, even in the brief news account, is unbearable. Even for a seemingly robotic man like Lindbergh, seeing his tiny, massively mutilated child on a marble slab had to be torture. Arriving at the back entrance to the funeral home around 4 p.m., he was escorted into the embalming room, where no embalming of what little was left of his beautiful son would take place. Charles himself lifted the sheet from the corpse. He looked intently and without apparent emotion at the remains, almost as if he was back in the Alexis Carrel laboratory at the Rockefeller Institute, in the role of scientist, examining a dissected organ. Knowing that the authorities needed a positive identification of the corpse, he asked for a sharp instrument to pry open the mouth. Then he examined and counted the teeth, 16 of them, and examined the right foot, finding the 2 distinctive toes that overlapped one another. The 2 overlapping toes is for those who believe in the conspiracy theory that he might have wanted the child, he thought he was defective. The 2 toes overlapping is another thing is mentioned. Finishing his impromptu examination, which was done in front of a hushed group of about a dozen observers, Charles looked up from the body and announced, "I am perfectly satisfied that is my child." He insisted that the remains be cremated as soon as possible. Whether doing so actually violated any New Jersey law requiring a fuller autopsy in cases of suspected homicides, and whether an exception to the law which shouldn't have been made was made because of the express wish of Lindbergh to do it, is not totally clear. For those who believe in the conspiracy theory that Lindbergh himself was behind the kidnapping of his own son, the fact that Charles directed the medical officers to move forward immediately with cremation seems to add to his culpability, as if he was moving to destroy evidence before a full autopsy could be done, discovering with certainty how the child died. But there was, in fact, an official medical and police determination of how Charlie had been killed. He met his death by, quote, a fracture of the skull caused by external violence. There was even speculation by certain doctors and detectives that the infant might have been dropped accidentally as he was being carried by the kidnapper down the ladder, possibly in a burlap bag, and that the extra weight of the boy, some 30 pounds, could have been enough to cause the thief's flimsy ladder to break at its least stable juncture. The explanation for Lindbergh wanting the body cremated yet that afternoon was not sinister at all. Considering the chronic, highly invasive intrusions by the press and the public at large into the private lives of the Lindberghs, there was no reason to think that the violations would stop at death. An unauthorized photograph of the awful remains of their child had already been taken by a man who had broken into the Trenton morgue. Might not another invader take a part of the famous Lindbergh baby? A finger, a toe, a tooth, a lock of hair, maybe even an eye, as people back in the Middle Ages had collected and displayed such bizarre objects as part of their veneration of martyrs and saints? If Charlie's body was buried, grave robbers might very well disturb it, steal from it, perhaps even snatch it in its entirety once more. How much money might people pay for such surviving memorials? Those who wonder why the Lindberghs wanted their beloved child cremated and cremated so quickly should think of the extraordinarily dreadful situation in which they found themselves. Perhaps then there would not be such fascination for any conspiracy theory, lunatic or serious, that Charles masterminded the crime. Later that day, the same day that Charles identified his boy's corpse, Friday, May 13, 1932, Charles A. Lindbergh, Jr., after a life of 618 days, was cremated at Rose Hill Cemetery in Linden, New Jersey. Early the following week, his father dispersed little Charlie's ashes in a flight over the Atlantic. It is not known whether Anne ever held or even saw the urn containing the sad remains. Well, I can stop there. I've got another excerpt I could read, but if you want to ask questions. This is Peggy can tell you, when I do books, I get pretty obsessive about them. This one, the one I never planned to write, is just sort of came out of nowhere and became something that the Lindbergh Foundation was not after. Although they know what I'm doing, and they're supportive of it, and I get a lot of help, especially from Reeve, and so I had a visit scheduled for her. She lives up in Vermont, but because of COVID, I was not able to do that, but I'll still manage to do that here sometime soon. I am about halfway through the book. The manuscript's already gotten very long. I had a meeting with my agent and my editor at St. Martin's, and to be honest about how long the manuscript's getting, my idea, I guess, was, because I've had books that get cut down quite a lot, and doesn't make the author happy most of the time. And I would actually like to see the book published in 2 volumes, so nothing has to get cut. But my editor wants me to move ahead, press ahead, keep writing like I am, and then we'll take a look at it at that point and see what needs to be done. And the press would prefer to get it out in 1 volume, but it's going to be, the first part of the book, which I could see is the first volume, which covers all the controversies except for the last one. I mean, everything that happens with the kidnapping, the eugenics, the fascism, the visits to Germany, the first America First movement, the controversy over him being anti-Semitic, that's all in the first part of the book. And I think the last part of the book can be handled a little more briefly than the first part. But I'm working away every day. My surgery next week, which is going to be a hip replacement, is going to maybe get in the way a little bit, but I'm hoping I can be back at the desk, as soon as possible to keep writing. The source materials are, mostly stuff that I'm looking for, stuff that Anne wrote and that Charles wrote. I've read it all very studiously, and I am going to still need to go to Yale University to see some of the archival material that has not appeared in publication. But I really believe I've got a book about the Lindberghs that will say something fresh and original, because I'm taking an approach that really hasn't been taken before. It won't be brand new for everybody, but it'll certainly have, I think, some unique perspective. And I'm not afraid of controversy. I don't look for it. I taught for 32 years at Auburn in history, and my students, would have arguments whether, is he a liberal or is he conservative? They never figured out my politics, and that was the way I taught. I don't look for controversy, but I don't see any way any book that tries to nuance Lindbergh, especially Charles, any book that tries to nuance him, I'm not setting out to defend him. I'm not setting out to excuse or defend him or apologize for him or anything like that. I'm just trying to understand him as well as I can, and then let the chips fall. But I'm afraid in the culture that we're in today, that sort of subtlety of understanding, of thoughtful understanding, has sort of gone by the wayside for a lot of people. They've already made up their mind what he is. You can hear it on TV coverage and talk shows all the time now. He's this or he's that. He is and he isn't. It's just really complicated. And I almost think, and this is an author talking, before you really could, I think my book has the potential to sort of change the narrative somewhat. But you almost have to read the whole book to do it. I mean, it's not like I hammer you with a point of view at the start. I don't. It's just sort of slowly unfolded in terms of their life and what happens with them and what they think about each other and what others think about them. But mostly if Anne's writing wasn't there for me, her diaries on almost daily basis, I couldn't do what I'm trying to do. Her writings. Of course, she wrote Gift. How many of you have read Gift from the Sea? I mean, her classic book from the 50s. I mean, that's a book that a lot of young women and men too have read over. It's really considered a classic. But her diaries really sort of changed my whole thinking about what I needed to do if I was going to do the book at all. I feel very close to both of them. Not because I necessarily, no matter what biography I've done in the past, it isn't because I don't find some warts, on folks and see some things that you wish, I wish she hadn't done that, or I wish Anne had been had not fallen quite so hard for the lone eagle. She had been a little more realistic in her marriage from the very start. It probably would have been. Or maybe even she would have been better marrying somebody else. I mean, she was a very different sort of person than Charles. And there's times I think, Dana Ashley that she had the affair with is much more like her, in terms of interests, literary interests, cosmopolitan, movies, books. Charles, wasn't really that sort of guy. So, you know, as a biographer, you have these private thoughts that you you sort of keep to yourself. But thank you very much. Appreciate it. And if there's a few minutes for questions. I'm not done writing, so I can't answer everything. Yes, sir.
I don't have a question, but I certainly thank you for your balanced presentation.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I hope I get a lot of that when the book comes out. I'm afraid I'm hoping I'll get mostly that, but I'm also pretty sure I'll get some people that think I'm defending him or somehow, you know.
Always good to hear it unbiased.
Thank you. You know, I try hard.
Have you already, or do you plan to interview any of the European women or children?
I definitely do. It's going to be tricky because only the one family's, Brigette's children are the only one that have gone public. Reeve Lindbergh has contact information for me. And I have not contacted them yet because I wanted to have a better grip on the story. Also in COVID, I wasn't going to be traveling to Germany and Switzerland. Maybe now I would do that. So that's definitely something I plan. What new I could learn, I would love to see, there was a slide where all the letters were gathered that Charles wrote. Charles, just a few days before he died of cancer in Hawaii in 1974. There's a letter that he wrote to all three women. We have Brigette's, the family at least has it. He wrote to Brigitte about a little less than a week before he died. So there was like a final letter to each one of these three women. I'd love to see that material. Now, what exactly new or different I would learn or be able to say, I don't know. But you know, I'm always on the side of, you know, give me as much information and then I'll see what I can do with it. But yeah, I think I try to leave no stone unturned. I want to know everything I can know, you know, and it's interesting. I do, you know, you do sometimes find yourself being maybe a little bit too proud. If I were just regurgitating and restating everything that's already been said about them, then I wouldn't see the purpose in wasting anybody's time with it. But I honestly think I've got something new. I honestly think that this could be could shake the ground a little bit for those who are interested in history and this particular story. And I'm not looking forward to the controversy, but I do want the book to be significant, you know.
Any more questions, comments? Well, I don't know what you did during COVID, but I cleaned out a couple of closets, and I was really proud of myself. I certainly didn't write a book and a half, so that's incredible. And to be able to take so much information and glean through it and to come up with something so incredible. Thank you so much, Dr. Hansen. We wish you the best. And if you listen to that excerpt and you don't want to read the rest of the book, then you were probably asleep, because I think you just pre-sold about 60 or 70 copies of your book by reading that. So thank you so much. Best of luck on your surgery as well.
Thank you.
Ms. Peggy, thank you for being here today, too.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Much appreciated.
Yeah. We'll go ahead and let y'all come on across the hall. I want to thank you all so much for being here today. I want to remind you, next week is the end of the Brown Bag series, and we finish up, as always, with Dolores Hydock. If y'all want to go ahead and slide on across the hall.
When I come back, then my next talk here, I'll make sure to shake everybody's hand and sign books and dance around on my new hip.
Thank y'all so much. If the door's locked, here's my key. We do want to remind you, Dolores Hydock is next week. You don't want to miss Dolores. And I do want to say again, always, always, thank you so much to our sponsor, to First Bank of Alabama. If you see these people out and about, please thank them, because they make this possible. Thank you so much to Hickory Street Cafe. Miss Jane Henderson, thank you so much for coming and always being such a sweet host. Thank you all for coming, and have a great afternoon.